At my own mother's funeral, my father picked up my insignia pin and threw it in the trash. I'm Emily, the daughter he once called just a secretary in uniform. That moment erased me from his will, but it wasn't the end. Have you ever been erased by your own family? Tell me in the comments what you would do if it happened to you. I stood so still that day, I felt like the wind might carry the rest of me away before anyone noticed I had been erased. The brass bugle cut into the quiet like a blade, each note clear and unwavering against the warm savanna air. It was early spring, the kind of day when the pine trees lean just enough to spill their scent into everything, and the air carries the taste of salt from the river. Sunlight flashed off the polished horns, off the chrome handles of the hearse, off every metal sewn across the rows of dress blues. And I, heels planted in gravel, hat brim shadowing my eyes, didn't move. Not when the honor guard raised their rifles, not when the folding chairs creaked as family members sat, not even when the flag over my mother's casket shifted under a playful gust like it wanted to fly away. I kept my breath measured. Dress blues pressed so sharp they could cut, gloves white as clean paper. My hands didn't shake as I reached into my pocket for the single object I had brought with me, a small silver insignia pin. My rank, my proof. The priest's voice was a low hum in the background, words about devotion and home front sacrifice rolling over me like static. My eyes stayed locked on the coffin. I stepped forward just enough to crouch, my skirt brushing against the wooden platform, and laid the pin on the edge, right next to the folded corner of the flag. My hand lingered there a second too long, my thumb brushing the fabric where her name was stitched into the lining. I whispered, low so that only I could hear, "For you, Mom." It was supposed to be small, private. Then I heard his shoes on the gravel. Richard Whitaker, retired colonel, lifelong commander of every room he ever walked into, leaned down from the front row, lifted the pin with 2 fingers like it was something sticky, and in one motion tossed it into the metal trash can near the podium. The clatter was loud enough that it cut through the bugle. "You're just a secretary in uniform," he said, loud enough for everyone gathered to hear. There was a soft gasp from the second row. Someone's folding chair groaned as they twisted to see. My cousin covered her mouth with both hands. The priest hesitated mid-sentence, blinked, and then tried to keep going as though the ceremony hadn't cracked open in front of him. I felt every eye on me. I didn't speak. I didn't flinch. My gaze stayed fixed on him. That was the moment, standing by my mother's coffin, the Georgia sun baking the back of my neck, that I decided I no longer owed him anything. Not protection, not silence, not loyalty. When the final note of taps faded into the trees, the world felt different. The air, the ground, even the flag looked altered, like someone had tilted the frame of my life by a few degrees. Inside the reception hall of the little red brick church, the air was heavy with the sweet smell of pound cake and instant coffee. Ceiling fans spun lazily overhead, clinking chains against brass fixtures. I stood by the door with a paper cup in my hand, fingers warming around it even though the coffee inside had long since gone cold. On a table near the back were neat stacks of printed programs. I picked one up and scanned the list of speakers, the paragraph about surviving family. My name wasn't there. Neither were my years. The slideshow flickered against the far wall, photo after photo of my mother. Holidays, base housing in Kansas, birthdays where she held 2 boys on her lap and smiled like her entire heart was in that frame. Not a single picture of me. Not even the one from last year, where she pinned my promotion bar with hands that trembled from arthritis, but eyes that shone with pride. I had sent those photos. I had written her obituary draft myself before deployment, but the final version, the one Dad gave to the paper, only mentioned her loving husband and 2 sons. Gone. Around me, conversation continued in hushed tones. People who had known me since I was 5 studied their coffee cups instead of looking my way. My stepmother Diane passed by holding a tray of lemon bars, offering me one with a smile so neutral it felt like customer service. I took it just to keep my hands busy and force myself to eat. It tasted too sweet, grainy between my teeth, the kind of sugar that sticks to the back of your tongue and refuses to leave. Grant came over once, patted my shoulder with a stiff hand that never quite settled. "You all right?" he said, though his eyes were already glancing past me. I nodded. It was easier than explaining everything that wasn't right. Brian didn't come at all. Every few minutes I caught people whispering, "She flew in from DC, right? I heard she's just admin. That's Richard's only girl?" Their voices brushed against me like cold drafts. I stayed because it felt wrong to leave her behind. My mother, Laura Whitaker, 34 years as a military wife, 12 moves, 3 kids. She was the one who taped postcards to our walls, the one who packed the car when orders came. And this room, filled with polished speeches about service and sacrifice, couldn't be bothered to remember her daughter. When the crowd finally began to thin, I went outside. The last of the sunlight pooled gold on the gravel, catching on the headstones like spilled coins. I stood there until the honor guard folded the flag and handed it to my father, their white gloves perfect, their movements silent. He took it without a glance in my direction. I stayed until the cemetery was empty. That night, I checked into a roadside motel just off the bypass. The sign buzzed red and blue through the window, the hum of the air conditioner masking the noise of traffic. The room smelled of bleach and old carpet. I sat down on the bedspread that scratched against my wrists and opened the small leather notebook I always carry. My hands didn't shake. I wrote 3 lines. They erased me. They erased my rank. Now I will write my own legacy. I closed the notebook and stared at the ceiling fan as it turned slow circles above me. In the silence, a memory returned, so clear I could smell the heat of that Alabama day years ago. I was 8. Standing outside in a starched little dress, waving a paper flag as the buses rolled back from deployment. My brothers ran toward him, shouting. My mother cried, and I waited, expecting him to scoop me up like the hero from the storybooks. He walked straight past me and saluted the base commander. That night, when I asked why, he patted my head and said, "You're tough. You don't need coddling." And like every good soldier in training, I believed him. Until today. I switched off the light, pulled the thin motel blanket over me, and let the sound of the fan drown out the last of the whispers from that church hall. I didn't sleep much. By morning, I had a plan. I wasn't going back to DC to hide. I was going back to begin. I came back to DC carrying 1 suitcase and a quiet fury that nobody could see but me. The air smelled different when I stepped out of Reagan National, cooler, edged with jet fuel and wet pavement. Late spring in Washington has a way of pretending to be gentle. The sycamores along the highway had just opened green, and the wind lifted the edges of my jacket as if testing to see whether I'd brought back anything softer than anger. I took a taxi straight to my apartment. It's the sort of place you rent because you're never there long enough to hang pictures. White walls, 1 chair, a bed, and a small window that looked down at the brickbacks of other buildings. On the counter sat a single mug with my mother's photo propped against it, a snapshot of her laughing in a ball cap, holding a paper cup of lemonade at some county fair. I touched the frame before I unpacked. The next morning, I laced up my running shoes and ran, past joggers on the mall, past the reflecting pool where the early light looked like silver foil, past a man walking his terrier who nodded as though we knew each other. I ran until my breath settled, until my head cleared enough to remember the 3 lines I had written in that motel room. They became the spine of a plan. Fort Myers smells like coffee and starch in the morning. When I walked back onto base in full uniform, the guards at the gate saluted and I saluted back. The motion so automatic they almost felt like breathing. Colonel Sandra Beach was waiting at my desk before I even made it through the door. Her eyes always have that sharp glint, the kind that misses nothing. "You look like someone who finally made a decision," she said. I set my bag down and sat, smoothing the edge of my skirt. I did. She studied me for a beat, then slid a folder across the desk. "Good, keep yourself busy. It works better than anger." "I'm not angry," I said. She raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. I started small. Quiet. I filed paperwork with the records office to have my name added to my mother's headstone. No speech, no drama, just a form that would take 2 weeks to process. Then I called the Veterans Affairs office to request copies of her care documents. "For my own files," I said when they asked why. My voice stayed even, polite. Finally, I called the county clerk's office back in Savannah. "I believe there was an earlier version of my mother's will," I said, "the one that included my name." There was a pause on the line. I could hear the faint click of a keyboard, the shuffle of papers. "We do have something you might want to see," the woman said at last, "but I can't send it over the phone. You'll have to come in." I wrote the words down in my notebook. That night, sitting at my little table with the mug and the photo of Mom, I opened the notebook to a fresh page. The 3 lines I'd written before were still there, pressed deep into the paper as if I'd carved them. Below them, I began a list. 1. Cemetery. Request headstone update. 2. VA. Request care records. 3. County clerk. Old will. Old letters. I underlined the last one twice. After that, the memories came in like a tide. 2015. The first day of training, the air at Fort Jackson thick with humidity, my hands blistered from drills but my heart steady. 2017, a dusty base in Kuwait, a map spread out in front of me on a folding table, radios crackling. A convoy stranded miles away, and I was the one who traced an alternate route with nothing more than a pencil and a satellite photo that was already 2 weeks out of date. They made it back. No one outside that tent knew my name. I never told my father. Every time he asked, I said I was fine. And maybe I was, until now. Days began to take on a rhythm. Mornings on the mall with running shoes that kicked up gravel. Afternoons at Fort Myer, where the hum of computers and the shuffle of files felt almost like camouflage. Evenings in the apartment, the city's glow stretching across the blinds. Dinner was usually a paper cup of instant ramen, steam curling like little ghosts into the air. I'd set the mug with Mom's picture across from me at the table like she was there. It wasn't something I ever admitted to anyone. On the floor, next to my running shoes, lay the same dress blues I had worn to the funeral, cleaned and pressed, ready for travel again. I kept the plan to myself, but there were 2 people I trusted enough to sense it without asking. Beach, with her quiet way of watching me without judgment, and Master Sergeant Arena Price, who called one evening just as I was finishing another run. "I heard about your mom," she said. "Yeah," I said, catching my breath. "You doing okay?" "I'm working on it." Arena had been with me in Mosul when things went sideways and somehow steadied. A woman who knew how to make the ground feel solid, even when everything around it cracked. "You need anything, you call me," she said. "Not yet," I said, "but I might." On a warm Friday evening, I sat cross-legged on my bed, laptop open, flight search page blinking. The phone call from the clerk echoed in my head. "We do have something you might want to see in person." I stared at the departure times for Savannah. I remembered that smell of pine, the low brick buildings, the folding chairs, and whispered conversations. I wasn't going back for forgiveness. I was going back for the truth. The woman at the county clerk's office looked up, saw my name on her list, and said quietly, "We've been expecting you." Her voice carried over the soft hum of an old ceiling fan that was barely moving the heavy summer air. I had walked in from the parking lot with sweat sticking the inside of my blazer to my back, but hearing those words cooled me more than any air conditioner could. I gave her my ID. She gave me a look that held a question she wasn't free to ask, then said, "Follow me." The hallway was long, painted the pale yellow of school hallways, lined with bulletin boards covered in outdated notices about property auctions. At the far end, she opened a door into a records room that smelled like paper and ink and the faint tang of old dust. On a table sat a file, thick and worn. "Here," she said, sliding it toward me. "This is the original will, 5 years old." I opened the folder with both hands, as if even the paper might be fragile. The words blurred for a moment before they steadied. "To my daughter, Emily Whitaker, I leave my piano, my journals, and the locket she gave me at her officer candidate school graduation." There it was, my name written plain as daylight, a truth no one could erase from a page. I didn't realize how long I stared at that line until the clerk spoke again, softer this time. "There's something else." She pulled out an envelope, cream-colored and sealed, the edges soft from years in storage. Across the front, in handwriting that bent just a little to the left, was my name. "She left this," the clerk said. "She asked us to keep it with the file." I broke the seal with careful fingers. The paper inside had the faint scent of lavender, my mother's perfume, and a few specks of dust that stuck to my hands. It said, in her slanted, careful letters, "If you're reading this, it means he found a way to win again. I wanted you to have the piano. I wanted you to have my words. And I wanted you to know, in case I didn't get the chance to say it out loud, that I am proud of you. More than you will ever know. I have watched you build yourself, piece by piece, into someone strong enough to stand even when no one else sees it. And I hope, wherever this letter finds you, you will remember that being seen was never as important as knowing yourself. My girl, my soldier, don't let them tell your story for you. The words blurred again, but this time it wasn't because of the heat. I folded the letter slowly like something precious and slipped it into the inside pocket of my blazer. My hand stayed steady even though I could feel a pulse at the base of my throat. The clerk said nothing, just touched my elbow lightly as she led me back to the front. It was the smallest of gestures, but it told me she understood. At the counter, I signed the release form for the documents. She gave me a copy of the old will, a receipt, and said, "I'm sorry for your loss, Lieutenant Commander." Her use of my rank felt like a kind of respect I hadn't heard all week. Outside, the heat hit me like a wall. The courthouse steps baked under the noon sun, cicadas buzzing in the trees with a sound like the whole air was alive. I carried the folder pressed against my chest and walked back to the car. At a diner on the edge of town, I stopped long enough for a late breakfast. A plate of grits with butter melting in the middle, scrambled eggs, and a cup of coffee so strong it seemed to jolt me upright with every sip. The waitress called me "Hun" and left the sugar shaker on the table. I opened my notebook between bites and wrote just one sentence. It's not about the piano. That afternoon, back at the motel, the air conditioning rattled but didn't quite cool the room. The fan above my bed clicked in a slow, steady rhythm, as if keeping time with my thoughts. I spread everything out on the bed. Copies of my service records, commendations, training certificates, photos from tours overseas, most of which my family had never seen. Letters from commanders, printouts of logistics simulations, notes from nights in places no one wants to remember. Beside them, I laid out the copy of the will. And last, the letter from my mother. I opened my binder, the one that had traveled with me through moves and deployments, and turned to a clean section. At the top, in thick black ink, I wrote, "Reclaiming the record." Underneath, I began to slide each document into a clear sleeve, one after another. Paper-proof, each piece a counterweight to the silence my father had tried to build around me. At the center, I placed the letter. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time staring at the binder. I thought about that girl at 8 years old, holding a paper flag and waiting to be noticed. About the years in desert heat and cramped offices, the nights listening to radio static waiting for voices to come home. About how my father's voice had carried more weight than mine for as long as I could remember. And about how a single page of my mother's handwriting had just changed everything. The heat of the day gave way to a slow, syrupy twilight. Through the window, I watched the sky over Savannah shift from bright gold to violet, the parking lot lights coming on one by one. Somewhere beyond the trees, the cicadas were still buzzing. I picked up the letter one more time, smoothing its edges. This wasn't about an inheritance anymore. It was about setting the record straight. I folded the letter carefully, placed it in my jacket pocket, and closed the binder with a quiet, final snap. By the time the ceiling fan clicked me into sleep, I already knew. I wasn't just going to keep records. I was going to make sure they couldn't erase me again. 2 years after the funeral, I pressed the creases into my dress blues with a steadiness my father would never recognize. The hotel room was silent except for the hiss of the iron and the steady thump of my own heartbeat. I laid each sleeve across the board, the scent of starch rising like a faint memory of laundry rooms on base, of careful hands doing things right even when no one was watching. Outside the tall window, Atlanta's spring air shimmered with haze, the city caught between a bright morning and the promise of something heavier later in the day. On the bed behind me, my suitcase stood open, and on top of it lay a folded page that I had unfolded a dozen times since I arrived. My mother's letter. I lifted it again, smoothing the crease with my palm. The paper had grown soft at the edges, but her handwriting hadn't faded. Those slanted letters, her gentle tilt of each line, felt like a hand on my shoulder. I read the words silently, just once more. My girl, my soldier, don't let them tell your story for you. The room blurred, not from tears, but from the force of keeping them back. I folded it with precision and tucked it into the inside pocket of my jacket, the fabric pressing against my heart like armor. Then I stepped in front of the mirror. The woman in the glass stood taller than the one who had left Savannah 2 years ago. The insignia pin glinted just beneath my name tag, polished so bright it caught even the dim hotel lamp. I raised my right hand in a slow salute, not for them, for myself, for the 8-year-old girl who once held a paper flag and waited, for the officer who had learned to make maps out of chaos. I held it a moment longer than necessary, then let my hand fall. The morning of the ceremony, the convention center was a hive of movement. Flags lined the wide hallways in perfect symmetry, their fabric barely stirring in the climate-controlled air. The polished marble floors reflected the shoes of soldiers, officers, families, rows of polished shoes, dresses, pressed suits. The smell of coffee and floor wax mingled together. Conversations swelled and softened like waves against the walls. Backstage, the hum of the crowd was louder, closer. I stood in a line with others, all of us in dress uniforms, each of us balancing stillness with the weight of what had brought us there. I could feel the cool metal of my medals against the fabric of my jacket as I shifted. My fingers found the edge of the breast pocket again, just to make sure the letter was still there. A young soldier next to me whispered, "Good luck," his voice low and steady. I glanced at him and nodded once. "You too." Names were called one by one. Each time someone stepped out into the light, the sound of applause swelling for a moment, then fading as the next name was prepared. I closed my eyes briefly and imagined the room, the flags, the rows of chairs, the people leaning forward in their seats. Somewhere out there, I knew, my father sat. He and Grant, front row of the third section, like they owned the air between us. Then I heard it. For exceptional service in multi-theater strategic operations and for exemplary dedication to national security, Lieutenant Commander Emily Whitaker. The hall was silent for a fraction of a second, like the air itself had been caught off guard. Then the applause came, rolling forward like a wave. I walked out, slow and deliberate, the stage lights flashing off the rows of ribbons on my chest, off the insignia pin he had once thrown into a trash can. Halfway across the stage, my eyes found him. Richard Whitaker. His face was frozen, his knuckles white against the edge of the program in his lap. Beside him, Grant sat equally still, the stiffness of a man who knows the room is seeing something he cannot undo. I did not slow. The general stood at the center, hand extended. I took it firmly, felt the weight of the commendation in my other hand as it was placed into my grasp. Flashbulbs popped, bright and sharp like bursts of lightning. "Congratulations," he said. I nodded, turned toward the crowd, and saluted. Not to them, not to him. To the flag. To the people who had served beside me in silence. To the letter pressed against my chest. The applause rose again, and this time I let myself hear it. When I stepped back from the salute, I caught one more glimpse of my father. His mouth was a tight line, his eyes dark, and for the first time in my life, he had no words. Grant shifted beside him, his face caught between disbelief and something else, something like fear of how quickly the story had changed. I descended the steps from the stage slowly, feeling the weight of the medal in my hand. It wasn't heavy, not physically, but it felt like it carried all the years they had tried to erase. And then I heard it, the buzzing of my phone from inside my pocket, insistent. I didn't look at it, not yet, but I could imagine what was coming. Messages, headlines, photos of me in that moment already spilling out into a world that had never been invited to see me. As I reached the back of the hall, a reporter I didn't know brushed past, phone in hand, whispering to someone, "Did you see her father's face?" I kept walking. The door to the quiet of the backstage hallway swung open and I stepped through. For a moment I stood alone in that narrow space, the hum of the crowd muffled behind me, the cool air pressing against my skin. I opened my hand and looked at the medal resting there, shining in the fluorescent light. The buzzing in my pocket started again. As I stepped off the stage, my phone began to buzz. Messages, headlines, the sound of a door that will never close again. I exhaled slow and steady and walked toward the light at the end of the hallway. The next morning, he sat on a panel about leadership. I sat in the last row and let the whispers carry my name down the aisle. The conference room was colder than I expected, the kind of recycled hotel air that seeps into your sleeves. Rows of padded chairs stretched toward the stage. I slid into the very back, civilian blazer buttoned tight, notebook tucked under my arm. On stage, my father and my brother sat shoulder to shoulder, perfectly matched in navy blazers and small flag pins. Behind them, a banner stretched high, building leadership across generations. The moderator's voice was smooth, practiced. Today, we honor Colonel Richard Whitaker and his son Grant as pillars of family service. A murmur drifted down the row in front of me. "That's her," someone whispered. "The officer from yesterday. Did you see her medal?" I kept my eyes down, tracing the spiral binding of my notebook with my thumb. My father cleared his throat into the microphone. Service, he began, isn't about medals or missions. It's about... He stopped. I saw it from the back, a falter, as if the word had been knocked from his throat. Someone in the third row turned to glance at me. Others followed. He swallowed hard, found his sentence again, but the tone had changed. His voice was thinner, as though even he could hear the new weight in the room. I stayed until the panel ended, until the applause thinned out and the crowd drifted to the lobby. Then I left, silent as a ghost, back into the Atlanta sunlight. 2 weeks later, the gala. The Pentagon had sent an invitation, printed on thick paper with gold embossing, and I had stared at it for a long time before saying yes. That evening, the marble hall outside Arlington gleamed like a film set. Crystal chandeliers hung high, catching the flags that lined the room. The low hum of uniforms and evening gowns mixed with the clink of glassware. I stood behind a heavy curtain, the same uniform from Atlanta, pressed and perfect. My notes, a few folded sheets, sat in my hand. My fingers traced my mother's handwriting on the paper hidden in my pocket. "Lieutenant Commander Emily Whitaker," the announcer called. I walked out, the stage lights warming my shoulders, the sound of my shoes tapping against the wood floor. I set my notes on the podium, adjusted the mic, and looked at the faces. Rows of stars, ribbons, civilians with watchful eyes. "I was told once," I began, my voice steady, "that I was just a secretary in uniform." The room quieted, and for a long time I believed that, until I realized something. Silence doesn't mean small. Supporting doesn't mean weak. And sometimes, I paused, the person behind the map table has already walked every road you're afraid to step on. I didn't add anything else. The words hung there like a flag caught in the wind. Applause began softly, then rolled across the hall like a wave breaking on the shore. Somewhere in the crowd, I saw Colonel Beach smile. Not broadly, just a small tilt of approval, the kind you notice only when you know her well. By the time the gala faded into night, the news had already spread. Clips from the medal ceremony and the speech made their way into military newsletters, local papers, social media threads. People from my past, some I hadn't heard from in 10 years, sent texts, emails, half-formed apologies. And then the summons came. Fulton County Courthouse stood in the heavy Georgia summer like a red brick sentinel. On the morning of the hearing, the air was thick. Cicadas buzzing in the trees. I arrived in uniform. No entourage. Just a binder in my hands. The security line moved slow. A woman in front of me fanned herself with a folded newspaper. In the courtroom, everything was wood and paper. The air smelled faintly of dust and floor polish. A clock ticked on the wall, so loud it seemed to mark the seconds in bold. The judge entered, and we stood. My father sat across the aisle with his lawyer. Grant was nowhere in sight. The case was short. My attorney presented the letter, the will dated 5 years ago, and the forensic analysis. Signatures that didn't match. A notary stamp from a woman who had been dead 3 years when the update was filed. He handed over my mother's letter. I had read it so many times that I could hear the words without seeing them. The judge adjusted her glasses and read silently. Then she looked up. "Given the evidence presented," she said, "the original will is reinstated. The disputed version is void. Ms. Whitaker, your name will be restored as intended. Further, given the apparent irregularities, the portion allocated to Grant Whitaker is hereby frozen, pending additional investigation." Her gavel came down with a sharp, echoing crack. Just like that, the room breathed out. I felt my shoulders loosen, not in triumph, but in relief. Outside the courthouse, the sun was unforgiving. Heat rose from the pavement. I stepped down the wide stairs slowly, the binder still in my hand. Behind me, I heard his shoes before I saw him. "Emily," my father said. I turned. He was alone now, without the lawyer, without the crowd. "You won," he said. His voice was quieter than I remembered. I shook my head. "No," I replied. "I corrected the record." He blinked, looking at the courthouse doors as if they might offer him a way back. I waited. He said nothing else. Finally, I turned and walked away. The following week, a courier delivered a small velvet box to my office. I set down my coffee, opened it carefully. Inside lay my insignia pin, polished to a shine, and nothing else. No note, no apology. Just the weight of something that had been thrown away once now returned in silence. I held it in my palm for a long moment, feeling the cool metal warm against my skin. I placed it on the edge of my desk beside my mother's letter. Then I picked up my pen and started writing again. A week later, a small velvet box arrived at my office. Inside lay my insignia pin, polished and wordless. By Memorial Day, my office overlooked the Potomac instead of my father's shadow. The glass wall behind my desk framed the wide silver ribbon of the river, glinting under a clear May sky. Washington in late spring has a certain smell: cut grass, old stone warming in the sun, a hint of the tidal basin somewhere out of view. My office was quiet that morning, the kind of hush that only comes when the building itself is holding its breath. On the shelf behind me sat a folded flag, the same one from my mother's coffin, now encased in glass, its certificate amended with a single stubborn fact: survived by her daughter. I was reviewing notes for the Memorial Day ceremony when there was a tentative knock on the open door. A young cadet stepped in, all straight lines and nervous energy. "Cadet Natalie Holmes," she said, almost at attention. "Thank you for meeting me, ma'am." Her folder was clutched to her chest like a life vest. "Come in, I said, gesturing to the chair opposite my desk. She sat, glanced around, and her gaze stopped on a framed photo on the wall. "She looks kind," Natalie said softly. I followed her eyes to the picture. My mother in a simple summer dress, a hand on my shoulder, caught in the middle of laughing at something no one else remembered. "She was," I said. "She believed in me before the world did." Natalie nodded, then opened her folder. She wanted mentorship, advice, direction. But in that moment, I realized what she wanted most was proof that someone like me, someone once invisible, could be seen. Later that afternoon, after Natalie had gone, another knock came, lighter this time, hesitant. Amelia. She was 16 now, freckled cheeks, hair escaping from a loose braid. Mud streaked the sides of her sneakers as if she'd come straight from running across the mall. "Hi," she said, almost whispering. I waved her inside. She held a small box in both hands. "I found this," she said, setting it on the edge of my desk. "In his study. I thought you should have it." Inside was a letter, yellowed at the edges, the handwriting angular and surprisingly careful. I read it once silently. "I erased you. I see you now. You became something I never had the courage to be." The words stopped there, no signature beyond his name. I closed the envelope slowly, feeling Amelia's eyes on me. "I don't know if he meant it," she said quickly. "I think he was still trying," I answered, and that was enough. We sat in the quiet for a moment before I smiled at her. "Thank you for bringing it." Her shoulders dropped, the tension of a girl who had crossed a line to bring me something she wasn't sure I wanted. Memorial Day dawned clear, the kind of blue sky that makes flags stand taller. Arlington was already alive with the sound of footsteps on gravel, the low murmur of families, the occasional rustle of wreaths being set in place. I stood behind the podium, my speech folded neatly in my hand, the breeze tugging gently at the hem of my jacket. Rows of white headstones stretched out like an ocean, each one carrying a story no one could tell in full. When my name was announced, the crowd stilled. "I am the daughter of a veteran," I began, "and a veteran myself. For most of my life, only one of those titles was accepted at my family's table." The air was so still that even the flags seemed to listen. There are those who serve loudly, with parades, speeches, and declarations. And there are those who serve quietly, in war rooms, in casualty reports, in strategies that prevent disaster before it ever appears. I let the words settle. To every woman who was told she was just something, a clerk, a nurse, a planner, a secretary, I offer you this truth. Your work saved lives, even when no one clapped. I stepped back. For a moment, there was only silence. Then the sound of hands coming together, slow and sure, not just applause, but understanding. After the ceremony, I made my way to my mother's grave. The grass was short and damp, the headstone smooth beneath my fingertips. I knelt, unpinned the insignia from my jacket, and set it gently at the base of the stone. The sky was bright above, and the flag nearby lifted and snapped in the breeze like a door opening. "You erased me," I whispered. I wrote myself back in. I stayed like that for a long moment, hand pressed to cool marble, before standing. As I walked back, I saw them, Natalie and Amelia, standing side by side at a respectful distance, watching. The wind lifted their hair and the flags around them. I gave them a small nod, one that meant, "It's yours now. This space, this voice, this chance." For the first time in years, the weight of old battles felt lighter, like a door I didn't need to close because I had already stepped through it. I didn't need anyone else's permission. I walked away from my mother's grave with the breeze still lifting the flag behind me, and for the first time in years, I felt light. Everything I had fought for, my place, my name, the truth, no longer felt like a battle, but like a homecoming inside myself. What I have learned is simple. Families can hurt us deeply, but they can't decide who we become. Respect is built over time, and sometimes you have to be the one to start over, even when no one claps for you. Life has taught me that silence doesn't have to mean surrender. It can also mean strength, waiting for the right moment to speak. If this story touched a part of your own, I hope you'll share your thoughts with someone you trust. Maybe it will remind you of someone you need to call, or someone who always believed in you before the world did. And if you'd like to walk with me a little farther, stay close. There are still more stories to tell.